What's happening, folks? Geologist Philip Prince talking coal country today, looking out over the Jewel Coke Oven, southeast of Grundy, Virginia, looking out towards McDowell County, West Virginia. This is a fascinating part of the United States. You hear a lot about it. You don't hear a lot about why it looks like it does and why it has the resource history that it does. It's been culturally influential. It has been exceedingly influential in terms of resources and the energy it's provided. But most of what you hear about it is actually very far removed from why this place is exactly as it is, including this incredibly rugged landscape that you're looking at right now. So I want to talk about that. I want to talk about how geology has shaped this landscape. One of the more interesting interactions between geology and topography and culture and so many other things that you're going to find. And to start understanding that, you got to put this place into the context of the rest of the Appalachian mountain range. And if you took eastern part of the United States and covered every place that has rock associated with, in one way or another, the collisional Appalachian events, it'd be a huge area. Pretty much what's covered here, and there's even more of it that's buried under coastal plain sediment. What we're going to be talking about today is going to be largely in this area, part of the Appalachian Plateau, which itself is much larger. And the reason I want to focus on that first area is that it has a certain topographic style. The appearance of the landscape is very unique, even within the Appalachian Plateau. But generally speaking, the plateau is a big area, and of course, throughout its extent, there's some similarities in the topography, and the potential for coal, among other fossil fuels, is very great. As you start looking at the landscape, you see that people have known about that for quite a while and are still actively pursuing those energy sources. You can actually see mountaintop removal basically from space. Those white scars are where you're seeing soil and bare rock. Controversial issue, but an efficient way to get that energy out of this basin. And we're going to be talking about just why that is a thing that you can do here later on. But looking beyond that, just at the appearance of the land, if you put a colored elevation map on it, really incredible patterns start to emerge. Up there in the top left in that plateau area, crazy branching river systems, looks like veins or lightning bolts or something like that. Really exceptional pattern and very distinct from what you got in the Valley and Ridge here, or the Blue Ridge, or out into the Appalachian Piedmont. Charleston, West Virginia, right there. Pikeville, Kentucky, Point Pleasant, West Virginia, of Mothman fame. All of these places are among other population centers within that Appalachian Plateau. And if you even go to these places, like the way the city has to be laid out is different from what you might do in a different part of the U.S., simply because the landscape itself places limits on how building can sort of spread out. And to get a sense of what I mean by that, you can just go to Google Maps. You don't need a special map like that. When this is centered over Prestonsburg, Kentucky, we'll zoom in right there and you immediately start to see the complexity of the topography there and the general lack of any flat land. And it just keeps going the more you zoom in. It's tough to look at this and tell even what direction all of these stream valleys would be flowing in. You get place names like the right fork or the left fork or the straight fork and things like that. It's an absolutely incredible spot. And like I'll say several times here, one that to my knowledge doesn't have parallel anywhere else in the world. Now, looking at the grain here south of Prestonsburg gives you a pretty good sense of what the topography looks like. But if you take another one of these colored elevation maps and look at a nearby area, the patterns are even crazier. And this really allows you to see that vein-like appearance in good detail. Interestingly enough, this is the Loretta Lynn home place, Butcher Holler, up above Van Leer, Kentucky. Only YouTube video that's going to show you this view, guaranteed, but it does give you a sense of the actual essence of these landscape patterns, which look like they ought to be in biology instead of geology. Really incredible place. And if you take that grain south of Prestonsburg there and compare it to what you got over in Grundy, a lot of similarities, a little bit of difference. You can tell there's even kind of more detail, if you want to call it that, around Grundy here. The relief is a little bit bigger, and ultimately that speaks to some of these geologic details, which you're going to be hearing more about. Pretty much all of the plateau area has a potential to look like that. This is up in southwestern Pennsylvania. A little bit less relief, but again, the same type of patterns are present there. Now, starting to understand what makes it look like that requires you to look at other places around it for comparison. Where does it start and stop? And in this case, boundary between the valley and ridge and the plateau is pretty easy to see. It's a really cool drive on US 460. Turn right in Raven, Virginia, go up over Short Gap and come down through Grundy. And what you're going to see in the valley and ridge compared to what you're going to see over towards Grundy is very distinct. One of the more interesting places to check out geography and geology and landscape and culture in the U.S. Again, you don't hear a lot about it, but this is a drive that absolutely I think everyone should do, because it will show you just how different life will look depending on the landscape you live in and ultimately the geology that you live on. Now, in terms of starting to put this into the bigger geologic picture, got to think about, again, where it sits with respect to the overall Appalachian mountain range. To do that, we're going to have to flip the view around. So imagine you're looking in the direction that that arrow is pointing. Here in Google Earth, we're kind of floating over the plateau. You've got Grundy and Pine Mountain down there. Imagine you turn this back into the old Appalachians when they were really huge. It might look something like the modern day Himalaya. And down there at the very foot of the mountains, where all of the sediment eroding off of the mountains is collected, you got a sedimentary basin, foreland basin. If there were coal in the one you're looking at here, it'd be buried down under the surface. The plant materials to form the coal would have been deposited when that foreland basin looked different. It would have been lower, swampier, and situated to kind of collect plant debris and not oxidize it before it got buried. Himalayas are pretty coal poor, but this gives you a sense of that foreland basin environment. Got thrusted and folded sedimentary rock that looks really different from that foreland basin. Then you got the huge mountains further there back behind it. Included in this view is Chomolungma, Mount Everest, Earth's highest mountain, just to give you a sense of what it looks like, again, within its overall mountain range surroundings. Let's turn that back into the modern day Appalachians and just take a look at those different zones there and keep your eye on them. And they actually match up pretty well to the view here in Appalachia. I actually used pretty much the same elevation in Google Earth, so the fit is not bad. You can't really compare them one to one that way precisely, but these same zones are absolutely present. The Appalachian Plateau is the exhumed sedimentary basin, means it's been unburied. The rock you're getting the coal out of at the land surface was once under 2 miles of rock, if not more than that. The valley and ridge is the thrusted and folded sedimentary rock. Literally miles, kilometers of rock has been eroded off of that. And once you get back there in the Blue Ridge, where it's still quite mountainous, yet more rock was eroded off of that, right? So erosion is the key to making Appalachia look like it does today, but overall, you can still see the parts matching up. And that triangle there is where Mount Everest would sit if you put it on that Appalachian map. So that's kind of an interesting thing to do. It's somewhere out like maybe between like Boone and Wilkesboro, North Carolina, sort of at the edge of the Blue Ridge and Piedmont, which is arguably not a bad match for the geologic domain it sits in the Himalayas as well. But generally speaking, this is the way to think about the environment that put the rocks under the Appalachian Plateau where they are to begin with, right? And if you cut this open, you'd end up with something like I drew in another video, which is going to have the future plateau, the future valley and ridge, and the future Blue Ridge. The plateau is flat-lying sedimentary layers. The valley and ridge is thrusted and folded sedimentary rock, and the Blue Ridge is where the mountain range is back there and much, much thicker. Now, the plateau there is both sedimentary layers that are the same ones you see in the valley and ridge. Down in the plateau, they're going to be way down deep under the surface. And then on top of that, that's where you're going to have that younger sedimentary material. And the key point is that it's flat lying. All right. It does not have tilting or folding to it. It does locally just a little bit, just a few degrees, but flat lying is the key ingredient. And if you put what the Appalachians of today would look like, it'd be something like that black line on there. So a huge, huge, huge amount of rock would have to be removed to expose the rocks we see in today's Appalachians. The reason that that is possible is that when the mountain range is set up like the one you see here, kind of at its maturity, the Earth's crust and actually the upper part of the mantle is like pushed down underneath it as the rock erodes away, it takes weight off of it and it can kind of slowly rise back up. So that's how you can maintain elevation over time. But suffice it to say, what we see in modern Appalachia was once deeply buried, but there are very distinct zones here. And in order to understand how this forms the topography that you see there in the plateau, gonna have to do another paint diagram. So hang on just a minute. Okay, here we are in paint, going to try to do a block diagram that's going to give you a sense of how bedrock geology controls the landscape in the plateau. And as we start laying this out, you might get a sense of what's going on already. Going to have some ridges and valleys there. And going to try to develop subsurface geology here pretty well, as well as the topography. So keep working on our outline here. And I'm going to try to use the fill tool here just a little bit today. I got a lot of comments about that on other videos, so we'll see if we can take standards up a notch. So we'll give it a green landscape surface there, and then start working on what's under the ground here in the valley and ridge, which is folded and faulted sedimentary rocks. And key thing out in the valley and ridge is wherever sandstone is up at the land surface, you're gonna see a ridge. And hopefully, if we do a good job with the fill tool, we're going to be able to make an interesting looking, almost geologic cross section here. We'll get it going, Hank. Okay. So those are going to be our sandstone layers. We'll get those filled in here in just a minute. A noticeable color there. Dark blue below that. We'll use kind of a lighter purple for some of the shallower layers. And the interesting thing about the valley and ridge is that those layers that are thrust up and tilted there came from deeper down. And actually that same pink sandstone layer is going to be down here underneath the plateau and goes right up under the valley and ridge. So we'll get that drawn in. Try to connect that dot. Something like that right there. We'll fill those in. Okay. Going pretty well. And then we'll need one more for that light purple there. Okay. Bring that around like that. Sort of an interesting arrangement there. We'll see if I can make that look like I want it to. May require a little bit of thought here, but that's going to be the valley and ridge. We'll fill in now what's underneath the plateau. Must not have a connected line in there somewhere. There we go. Let's try that. Okay, there's the plateau. So the plateau in tan there, that's younger layers. They're already eroded away off what's now the valley and ridge. They would have been there in the geologic past. And the key distinction is they're all flat lying and they're not even completely continuous. Like you have some areas where there's more sandstone than another, more shale than another, or more coal, for example. So we'll not even worry about having really continuous layers there, but we want it to look very closely and finely layered. And then we'll make like that right there. So we're still going to have those tan layers, but they're going to be folded just a little bit like the rest of the valley and ridge. Okay, so that's going pretty well. Let's put some gray down there for our deep basement rock. So this lays the groundwork out for the plateau and valley and ridge landscape. And at this point, the valley and ridge topography is no problem. This is the question that you want to see on the test right here. Those pink layers just make big high ridges, strong resistant sandstone, and we'll even have this purple layer here have enough sandstone in it that it's going to make a bit of a ridge right there. But sure enough, the pink layer there is going to be the dominant ridge former And that's absolutely the case in the Appalachian Valley and Ridge. It's a Silurian sandstone, often called the Tuscarora. It's a big package of sandstone beyond that, but that's the one that makes most of the mountains that you see in the Appalachian Valley and Ridge. So there's our Valley and Ridge Mountains, and it's geologically controlled. You have big, long expanses of that blue rock, which would be limestone or dolomite. You have long expanses of that light purple rock, which would have a lot of shale in it, have big expanses of the pink, the sandstone, and the landscape has to gear itself to make all those erode. So you need steep ridges on the pink, and you need kind of a flatter, more gentle valley for the weaker rocks so everything can move and erode at the same pace. Now, when you get out in the plateau, it's pretty much the same everywhere in all directions. And there's enough sandstone in it that it's pretty tough, mixed in with some shale so it can still fall apart. And because it's so even, there's not really any reason to have distinctions in stream style or slope style. That's what's going to give you those crazy branching networks where essentially everything is the same and everything's pretty steep because there's tough rock there. So it's a real unique arrangement, and it is absolutely controlled for the most part by the fact that it's dominated by this flat line geology. So we'll just start running some stream valleys out here. And we take these out far enough, and then they're going to fork. And then fork again, and we'll have one coming out here. And it's going to need a fork in it. We'll need a fork going out there. We'll need a fork going in this direction. And you can sort of get the idea of how you would allow this pattern to develop and ultimately just sort of carve the landscape up as much as it can possibly be carved up. I'm going to dissect this whole area. That's the geologic term for this. Run it and fast forward. Be back with you in just a minute. Okay, so out there in the plateau, basically all parts of the landscape are served by equally steep slopes. And when you're pretty far up in the stream networks, equally steep channels, as the streams get bigger, they tend to flatten out a little bit. But again, because there's no control that makes one area erode efficiently with flatter streams and one area erode better with steeper streams, it's branching networks evenly in all directions. Really fascinating. The one place that you see that change is going to be kind of right at this little ridge. It's still kind of that plateau type of rock, but it's folded, tilted just a little bit. This would be something like Abbs Valley, West Virginia, Virginia line, Bossie Vein, Pocahontas, places like that. Just a little bit tilting the rocks, and it's enough to turn it almost into kind of ridges and valleys, but it's distinct from what you get out there in the main valley and ridge. Now, how does this landscape style interact with the mountaintop removal? If you drew a cross section across there, you'd have something looking like that. The geology in that is all very nicely flat lying. And say your coal seam sits something like that, and you might see that same coal seam again across the valley over there. The easiest way to get to that is just to take kind of the pointed ridge off of there and lay all that stuff flat so you can just come take it off the surface. So it's an interaction of topography, geologic structure. I'd be interested to know how efficient that would be and how much removal you'd want to undertake if this was like a flat, even plateau. I'm not sure about that because the engineering side of that's kind of outside of my wheelhouse. But one way or the other, that's the basic idea behind why it's easier to come along and just totally reshape the landscape instead of actually producing shafts or big long walls or something like that, right? So really interesting part of the world. And fundamentally, The geologic differences that you see here and the amount of topographic distance in terms of this absolutely crazy grain versus these orderly ridges and valleys, direct result of the bedrock geology and the way that rivers have to interact with that just to keep things moving. Okay, so that's the big idea of how flat-lying sedimentary layers with alternating strength, some really hard ones, some weaker, some really hard ones, some weaker, can work with erosion to produce those incredible tangled networks of river valleys that we call dendritic networks because they look like branching trees. In the valley and ridge, where you have really extensive exposure of one rock type or another, uh, topography has to adjust itself so those different rock types can erode evenly. In the plateau, everything is pretty consistent everywhere. So the drainage network has to branch to a really extreme degree to sort of serve every place equally. So it's kind of a cool feedback between geologic structure, rock types, and how rivers work to move sediment out of the landscape. You can see some fundamental details of what's actually there in terms of rock type if you look at differences between the plateau landscape in different places. Paintsville, Kentucky kind of has its own pattern. Grundy has that slightly bigger relief. It's a little more rugged with a little more density of small drainages. And around Grundy, huge, thick sandstone sequences with the shale and coal mixed in. And once you get out towards Paintsville and even further out into the plateau, the really, really incredible sandstone horizons are starting to thin out just a little bit. That doesn't mean they're gone by any stretch, but the overall assemblage of rock layers are still flat lying, but the combinations are distinct and they produce a little bit different grain there. And then finally, kind of the icing on the cake here is the fact that, in effect, the entire Appalachian Plateau drains to the Ohio River. If you caught the other video about the ghost rivers, you know the Ohio River's course is pretty young geologically, and it has forced its tributaries to carve down into the landscape quite a bit in pretty recent geologic history. Start putting plateau rivers on there: Tug Fork, Leviza Fork, Licking River, Kentucky River, the New and Kanawha River, the Little Kanawha River. Uh, all of these rivers would have had to sort of adjust or respond to what the Ohio was doing, and in response to its incision, they probably carved up their drainage basins as well, just a little bit more. So the flat-lying rocks with the alternating strength will always have kind of a hill and holler grain to them. But if you have the rivers cut into them just a little bit more, it's going to make it that much rougher and that much steeper. And I would say almost certainly that has been a formative process here in today's Appalachian Plateau. So it's even rougher and more rugged than it would have been prior to the ice ages diverting those rivers and leaving those ghost river channels and things like that. So finally, can you see it anywhere else on Earth? This is the closest I got. Sichuan Basin, east of Chengdu, China. Comparable patterns, still not quite the same. Bigger through-going rivers, bigger, more concentrated valleys. It's just not there. I think having the combination of rock types that you have being part of this ancient mountain belt, the exhumed sedimentary basin, and having the Ohio River processes, all that has to mix together to make the plateau look like what it does today. So it's a really incredible spot. Again, it's one that every time you hear about it, frankly, it's usually for not a positive reason. But outside of that, there is nothing else like it. And it's a place that if you think about how it actually connects to what's under the ground there and what used to be there, the geologic past, it becomes more interesting and it starts to put its distinctions into context when you compare it to other parts of the U.S. So definitely give it a look. Like you saw here, you can explore it pretty well on Google Maps terrain and see some of those wild patterns. Guaranteed, it looks different from where you live unless you live there, right? So next time around, might get out of Appalachia, maybe not. I don't know. It's a pretty interesting place. Hope you enjoyed this one and hope you'll catch the next one as well.